Brian never considered himself an overly emotional or suspicious man. He grew up in a family where feelings were often hidden behind jokes or chores rather than discussed in the kitchen. Everything changed when Daisy came into his life, bright, passionate, sometimes explosive, sometimes charmingly gentle. She was always the one who brought the atmosphere of the big city with her, even to a quiet coffee shop on the outskirts of Chicago. They got married quickly. Brian and Daisy became not only husband and wife, but also business partners. Their small coffee shop began to bring in more and more profit, and soon they began to think about expanding. Opening a second location closer to the center was risky, but Daisy loved risks, and Brian trusted her blindly, as always. At first glance, everything was going well. But in early spring, Brian began to notice small, almost imperceptible changes in Daisy's behavior. She became nervous, overly emotional, and could suddenly fly off the handle over trifles. For example, she would make a scene over a cup left on the table or roses in a vase that were not cut properly. Her irritation was hysterical, and her excuses were superficial. She often stayed late at work, and at home she was always rushing somewhere, not even glancing at Brian. Her phone became off limits. As soon as her husband glanced at it, she immediately hid it or changed the subject. Brian tried not to read too much into it, attributing it all to fatigue and stress, but subconsciously he felt that something was wrong. The business seemed to be growing. Daisy, fiery and daring, convinced Brian that they urgently needed a new apartment. She insisted on looking for a place herself, saying that he had no taste, and she needed space for creativity. That was when a real estate agent named Alan, young, fit, and very confident, appeared in their lives. For Brian, he was just another professional in his field. But when Daisy mentioned Alan, her eyes lit up. He noticed it only once, but for some reason, this little detail stuck with him. Since then, Brian had been staying home alone more and more often, filling the void with work and trying not to think about his wife's strange aloofness. He felt as if he were standing at a closed door in his own home, and something important was left on the other side, but the key was gone. Every day between them grew colder, every argument louder, and the feeling of loss deeper. Daisy was no longer just arguing or throwing tantrums, she was lying, even when it wasn't necessary. She responded irritably to any question, got confused about trivial things, made scenes, and then pretended that nothing had happened. Brian gradually lost his footing due to her unpredictable antics and cold detachment. He did not yet know that the biggest shock was yet to come, and that all these little things were just a prelude to real pain. Brian always trusted Daisy, even when all his instincts screamed otherwise. However, unlike at the beginning of their relationship, this trust was becoming increasingly difficult. He caught himself looking for traces of truth in her eyes, listening more carefully to her words, trying to catch her intonations. Everything seemed somehow artificial. Daisy hardly ever laughed at his jokes anymore, didn't ask how his day had gone, and hardly ever left him warm messages. She now had her phone with her even in the shower, and that annoyed him, but it alarmed him even more. One day, returning home earlier than usual, Brian saw Daisy in the living room. She was standing by the window, talking on the phone, and didn't seem to be expecting him at all. There was so much tenderness in her voice, something he hadn't heard directed at him in a long time. When she noticed him, she abruptly ended the conversation, muttering a quick, later, into the phone, and turned to him with the same mask of an offended and tired wife. "Who were you talking to?" he asked calmly, although inside he was seething. "It was Alan," Daisy replied defiantly. "We're looking for an apartment." "What, now I can't even make a phone call?" "No problem," Brian replied, although he did have a problem. She didn't want to explain anything further and went on the offensive, saying that he was controlling her, jealous for no reason, and didn't care about anything. After that incident, he became more vigilant. Brian wasn't the type to rummage through other people's things, but this time he couldn't resist. One evening, when Daisy was rushing off to meet with the realtor, as usual, he saw her phone left in the kitchen. It felt awful, but temptation won out. He simply unlocked the screen, She hadn't changed the password, probably because she was in a hurry. The first chat that opened was with Alan. The tone of the correspondence was not businesslike at all: jokes, flirting, photos of interiors, and between them, their smiling faces. And one short but telling message: "I miss you. I can't wait for tomorrow night." Brian's legs buckled. He was no saint, there had been betrayals in his life, but this pain was completely different. It was humiliation and shock at the same time. It seemed to him that there was less air in the room, and he leaned against the wall, trying to somehow digest what he had seen. He didn't decide to act right away. It was painful to admit that his own home, his shared life, was just a backdrop for someone else's game. But from that moment on, there was no turning back for him. Brian decided to get to the bottom of it. He needed the truth, no matter how painful it was. For several days he just watched. Daisy became even more cautious, sensing something subconsciously, perhaps. She became even more prickly, often lying straight to his face, about meetings that had been postponed, about friends Brian didn't know, about little things that had previously been meaningless. But now he had no doubt. Her stories were just a smokescreen behind which she was hiding with Alan. And soon she would have to take off that mask. Brian couldn't stand this game anymore. He was consumed by anger and resentment, but at the same time he felt powerless, as if he had found himself in someone else's life, ridden by Daisy and her new friend. Every night, he replayed a possible conversation in his head, how he would tell her that he knew everything, how he would demand honesty, how he would react to her excuses. But in reality, everything turned out completely differently than he had imagined. It happened by accident. Daisy was returning home from another apartment viewing, all emotional, even slightly drunk. Her eyes were shining and her face was red. She immediately pounced on Brian with reproaches. "Why didn't you answer my calls? I shouldn't have to worry about where you are. Maybe you're seeing someone else?" His patience snapped. Brian silently placed his phone in front of her with the open chat with Alan, which he had photographed the day before. "So who's seeing someone else here, Daisy?" His voice was quiet but cold as ice. Daisy froze at first, then laughed loudly, sharply and nervously. She went on the offensive. She started screaming that it wasn't what he thought, that he had ruined everything himself by becoming cold and inattentive. She hurled accusations. "You never understood me, you're always working, you don't let me feel alive." Her hysteria grew, tears, screams, slamming doors, even a broken cup. "You were always controlling me. You don't appreciate me. You don't see anything except your coffee shop," Daisy shouted, wiping away her tears as if he had forced her to cheat on him. Brian tried to speak calmly, but Daisy didn't even hear him. She was already living in her own reality, where he was the main culprit. Every word she said was a mixture of lies and insults, excuses and attacks. She said that nothing happened with Alan, it was just flirting, that it's just a working relationship. And then suddenly, "Yes, I made a mistake, but it's because you pushed me." He could see that she was no longer trying to save their life together. All she cared about was not being found guilty. Brian felt strangely devastated. He had expected anger, shouting, broken things, but it was more like a failed scene from a cheap TV series. When everything calmed down, Daisy simply went to the bedroom, slamming the door behind her. Broken dishes and the smell of cheap perfume remained in the room. Brian stood in the middle of all this chaos and realized that their marriage was falling apart, and all the explanations were just a desperate attempt to save his own ego. He hardly slept that night. For the first time in all this time, he allowed himself to think, maybe this is the end? After that night, a depressing silence reigned in the house. Daisy hardly ever left her bedroom, sometimes running out only to go to work or take a shower, avoiding Brian's gaze. He, on the other hand, wanted to disappear from the house. He would arrive at the coffee shop long before it opened and return late at night, just so he wouldn't have to see her. But even at work, he couldn't distract himself from what had happened. Inside, Brian felt as if his life had suddenly lost all meaning. At first, there was shock. He couldn't believe that Daisy, the girl he trusted even more than himself, could lie to him so coldly and for so long. Then came anger. How could she blame him? How could she put all the blame on him? Brian smashed an old toaster against the wall because he couldn't calm his emotions any other way. He was angry at himself for not noticing everything earlier, at her for every lie she told, at Alan for coming into their lives so easily and arrogantly. Anger turned to devastation. The emptiness that remained after the confrontation was unbearable. Brian began to remember all the best things between them, their nights on the roof of their old apartment, her laughter, the first coffee shop they opened together, even those silly arguments that ended in hugs. Every detail hurt like a fresh wound. The days dragged on slowly. When Brian accidentally ran into Alan at a coffee shop, Alan looked him in the eye confidently, even defiantly. There was no remorse, just a cold smile and a short, "Sorry, buddy, that's how it goes." That was the final straw for Brian. He realized that there was no more room for hope or compromise. Brian tried to talk to his friends, but they either didn't want to get involved in other people's relationships or advised him to forgive or give it time. But he understood that nothing could be undone. Daisy was still physically there, but there was a deep rift between them that could not be repaired with words or apologies. She tried to talk to him several times, but each conversation ended in another hysterical outburst or attempt to blame him. Brian looked at her and saw a complete stranger, someone who had once been his closest friend, but now had become his greatest pain. Gradually, he realized that he was no longer afraid of being alone. He was more afraid of continuing to live a lie, where love was just a backdrop for someone else's betrayal. Loneliness came quietly. But with it came the first real relief from no longer having to pretend, no longer having to search for the truth among other people's words, no longer having to justify himself or her. Brian realized it was time to make a decision. Several weeks after the betrayal was revealed, they spent in a strange state of anticipation, as if both Brian and Daisy were reluctant to end the relationship, but already understood that there was no going back. Their shared home had become a place where each avoided the other. Their life resembled a silent film, the movements were the same, but there was no meaning anymore. One morning, Brian got up early, made coffee, and sat down with a notebook by the window. He began to write a list, what he felt, what he wanted, what was keeping him there. The list turned out to be short and painfully honest. He realized that the main reason for staying with Daisy was fear. Fear of starting all over again, fear of losing the memories that still seemed real. He remembered an old conversation with his father, who once said, "Honesty with yourself is the hardest thing, but it's the only thing that gives you the strength to move on." Brian finally felt ready to tell the truth, to himself and to Daisy. That same day, he gathered his thoughts and said clearly to her, "We can't go on like this anymore. I no longer want to and cannot live a lie. I'm filing for divorce." Daisy took this as yet another act of betrayal. At first there were tears and accusations, then she begged for a second chance, promised to change, cried, and paced from corner to corner. Her mood changed every minute, from despair to rage. Brian listened to her silently. With every passing minute, he felt his heart grow harder, not from hatred, but from the final realization that it was over. Daisy tried to negotiate, then screamed that he would betray their memories, saying that she would die without him. But it no longer worked. Brian understood that love should not be such a burden. He filed for divorce on his own and moved in with a friend for a few weeks. The coffee shop became his refuge and a way to bring himself back to life. During this period, he allowed himself to cry at night, to remember the good and the bad, even to drink an extra glass of whiskey while listening to his favorite records. But every morning he found the strength to get up, make coffee for his guests, and not lose himself completely. The decision to divorce was difficult, but it brought him a sense of inner freedom. He felt pain, loss, even anger, but these emotions no longer felt hopeless. It was the beginning of a new chapter, albeit with a bitter aftertaste. The divorce from Daisy was not quiet and smooth, as might have been expected. She continued to call, write long messages, and sometimes even came to the cafe, sometimes with apologies, sometimes with new accusations. But with each passing week, Brian became calmer and more confident in his choice. He learned to listen to himself, not to other people's screams or hysterics. Most importantly, he regained the ability to live honestly. At first, it was difficult to imagine a new life. Friends offered to introduce him to someone interesting, and coworkers joked that he now had the ideal bachelor status at the coffee shop. But Brian was in no hurry. He thought a lot about what had happened and about himself in all of this. The betrayal hurt for a long time, especially when he saw happy couples or when some little thing reminded him of their shared past. However, with each passing day, he discovered something new about himself. For the first time in years, he could come home calmly, turn on music, cook dinner just for himself, without fear or shame about his desires. He started running in the morning, sometimes just walking in the park, meeting people, listening to their stories. His world was becoming wider, freer. Sometimes his thoughts returned to Daisy, with sadness, but without anger. Brian came to the conclusion that love is not only about passion and infatuation, but also about choice. And if you choose someone, you have to be honest with yourself first and foremost. He learned to see the red flags, not to be afraid of loneliness, not to cover up betrayal with love or habit. As for new relationships, Brian was in no hurry. He wasn't looking for a wife, he was looking for harmony with himself. He wanted to trust again, but not at the expense of his own peace of mind. Now he knew, it was better to be alone than to be with someone who lied and cheated. Yesterday's pain became the foundation for a new, more mature self-confidence. Perhaps someday someone will come into his life who will appreciate his honesty and simplicity. Or maybe not, and that's okay too. The main thing is that he is no longer afraid of the truth and will not allow himself to be destroyed for the sake of someone else's convenience or hysterics. Everything that happened made him stronger. And although his heart still hurts sometimes, he knows that this pain will pass, and true love will surely find its way to someone who is no longer looking for it in someone else's arms.
Subscribe and like, and send the video to your friends.